Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. You're very welcome to our webinar, which is all about junior cycle geography, exam and CBA preparation. My name is Conor Walker. I work with the post-primary publishing team in Fowlands. And very shortly, I'll hand you over to Peter, who will take up the lion's share of the presentation this evening. But just a bit of housekeeping, first of all, before I hand you over to Peter. We're recording this, so you will get the recording of the webinar via fowlands.ie. We'll share the link to you in the chat to that, so that you can access it. But we're also going to make the slide deck available shortly afterwards as well. Just to know that Peter has some examples of student work that needs to be maybe removed from the deck, but when that's done, we'll make that available to you as well. So during the course of the presentation, if you've any questions, feel free to fire them into the chat, and we'll have a Q&A session then at the end of Peter's presentation, where we'll get through as many of them as we possibly can. So just on to the next slide there. It's worth maybe mentioning that this webinar is out in conjunction with the recent publication of our brand new Real World Geography Junior Cycle teaching package. It's its second edition, and it's made up of a textbook, a skills book, and a teacher's guide on the print side. And then there's a whole range of digital resources as well to support you in the teaching of junior cycle geography across the 3 years. It's quite a radical change in terms of its structure, and it's very much, I suppose, uniquely structured by learning goal or learning intention. So every chapter states the learning goal at the beginning, and then its subsequent structure is based on those learning goals. And then at the end of every chapter, there's then summaries and revision questions assessment that are kind of aligned, I guess, with respect to those learning goals. So it's great. And if you want to take a closer look at any of the resources, any of the books that we have for real world geography, please, you can do that by going onto fowlands.ie and browsing the ebooks or samples of the digital resources. So with that, I think I'll hand you over to Peter. He'll correct me if I've gotten any of this wrong, but Peter teaches at Wesley College, has done for many a year, I know, and he is a very active member with the AGTI and is a long-standing exec member, has had, I suppose, more many different hats as well in his role with them. So anyone I know who is a geography teacher joining us is probably familiar with Peter and has met him and spoken to him at those events. So with that, I'm going to disappear for the next 40 minutes or so, and I'll hand you over to Peter.
That's great. Thanks very much, Conor. So I'm going to jump straight in and just take a look at the spread of questions over the last 3 papers. So you have the sample paper to 2022 and the 2023. I'm going to pass this on to Conor, and we'll get this up on Fowlands Hive, so you'll be able to access it. But it's just an indicator of which sections of the specification have popped up in the exam paper over the last 2 years, and then taking into account the sample paper. So the bits in yellow weren't examined. So you can see, for example, LO 1.10 wasn't specifically examined there. That's kind of interesting, because LO 1.10 is really what the junior cycle specification is all about. It's about integrating different aspects, in this case of physical geography, and then you've got 2.9 and 3.9 as well. So it's interesting that hasn't come up specifically, but maybe there's difficulties with asking that question. Same with 2.6. Now, I haven't put them all up there because I couldn't fit them all neatly on the screen so that you could read them. But 2.6, there was a little bit question 5B last year, but there are a couple of areas that haven't been examined. So, looking forward to June this year, you might say to yourself, well, look, I'll make sure I have those bits in yellow covered, just in case, they might pop up. I haven't marked the junior cycle paper yet, in part because there's an obvious conflict of interest there, not just the fact that I'm an author, but also through my work at the AGTI, I wouldn't be able to do talks like this. but last year, between distinctions and higher merits, we were getting about 57% compared to, say, maybe 30% national average. Now, obviously, I'm in a very different school, but we would have a range of abilities because we would have a large number of SEN students as well. So I think the approach that we take tends to work quite well, and so I'm kind of really just sharing that with you this evening, and see maybe that strikes or rings a bell with you. But we'll see. The first one here, and actually I think I might be missing an image here. Now it's on the next slide. This was question 1, and really this is just to highlight to you that all these short name questions or identifier, they're all sort of 3 markers, right? And even the definition one there, finite energy, was 3 marks. One of the chats I had with my class just in advance of the mocks was just what's the best way to approach the paper, and we're still kind of working with this. But if you remember the previous junior cert paper, the old junior cert paper, where you had the short multiple choice questions and then the slightly longer ones, now it's all just jumbled up, and so students have to kind of figure out for themselves what's the best way to get through the paper. But they should note that these are all going to be 3 marks, and golden rule: never leave a question unattempted. Like, always try and get everything done. I've put in a sort of a sample answer there. It's kind of interesting that it's not exactly 1 for 1, but it's almost like there's 1 line of these little boxes that they give where there's 4 lines. It's almost like there's 1 line for every mark, give or take. And I've checked that across the whole paper, and it's not a hard and fast rule, but it's not a bad one. It kind of lines up for most questions. So what I'm saying to my students is, that's the space you've been given. You need to try and fill that space, and I don't mean fill it with big handwriting. You have to fill it with normal handwriting and hit the key terms, which actually brings me to this. Now, I know those keyword connections look like an eyeful, but I'll come back to it in a moment. That question on the weather instruments up on top of page 4, where they have to identify the instruments at A. So which of the following is which of the following is measured using instrument A? So rainfall is the correct answer there. And that's really a case of, can you identify the image? Can you recognize the name of it and connect the two together? And that's why I wasn't originally going to put in this keyword connections thing, that there's one of those at the start of each chapter in the book. But what that does, it's almost like a concept map, but it's also like a sort of a graphic organizer that connects different terms that are related. So, for example, you've got the weather elements at the top, down the middle, so temperature, air pressure, wind direction, wind speed, and so on, and then the instrument that measures them. And there's a couple of ways of doing that, but students need to know the key words, and they need to be able to put them into context. They're not going to be able to put them into context if they don't know the actual words themselves. So teaching the literacy and the things is very important, and I reckon that makes up, I haven't counted it, but it makes up for a big chunk of the paper. So the more retrieval practice you do with that, the better. And spaced retrieval practice, obviously not all at the same time, but the better. So those keyword connections are kind of important. And there's a bunch of games up on Foland's Hive that you can download that kids can play to help them kind of practice those. The question on the Ordnance Survey map there is kind of important. On the old junior cert, the marking scheme used to be statement and development, and I noticed that was on 1 or 2 of the mock papers this year, and I kind of thought that's a bit strange, because the marking scheme for the new junior cycle is VP for valid point. So for this question, they want 2 reasons, and they actually lay it out for you. No harm if you have Leaving Cert students to show them this, where on the part A's on the Leaving Cert question, there's usually something like, explain 2 reasons why climate change is happening, for example. And what I find my Leaving Cert students don't do is kind of go reason 1, reason 2. This is actually, they do it for them here. So no harm for them to know that's the style of question. It's junior cycle, but you get 2 points for naming the reason and then developing 2 reasons here. So what they did was they gave you the map and they gave you a grid reference. So I've actually copied and pasted that section, and you'll see it's an upland area with fairly even slope and some coniferous forest. But the question is, why would that be a suitable site for a wind farm? And the suggested answer is, it's an upland area, so it's away from housing. It's close actually to the port, so for bringing materials in and out. And it's on a slope facing, well, should be on the slope facing the wind direction, but you could actually have it so that the wind turbines are. So the main thing is that they have to give name the reason, and again give 2 valid points each, but really very, very importantly, give evidence from the Ordnance Survey map. So they have to have typically a specific grid reference or some specific reference. But when that can be a grid reference, that's really the way to go with that. So 14 marks in total. I haven't picked all the questions, but just 1 or 2 just to show you where we would approach it. This is a question that if it didn't come up in some shape or form, you'd kind of be surprised. So this question was, the students had to explain the process of how the process of deposition forms one river feature. And maybe next year, or maybe in June, it could be a feature of erosion, and then it might alternate back and forth the way it does for the leading cert. But it's kind of nice the way it's kind of marked. So it's 5 valid points, 2 marks for a diagram, which probably seems a little bit stingy, but 2 marks. And so in the textbook, the kind of approach I took to doing this is this feed approach, where you had feature, explanation, example, and a diagram. And it's actually good for the kids to actually start with the diagram first, because then it's like a visual hint or a visual reminder of what they should write about. Now, I've actually edited that image from the one in the book just to put in the 2 labels, because there isn't a whole heap of marks for it. But you also don't want them to be spending a terribly long time drawing that image. And while there's color on that one, they're not going to get marks for color. So it's get an image down as quickly as you can, little diagram that will help them pick out terms that they can put into sentences. So I think between defining what levees are and where they're found on the river, and then explaining how they're formed, during flood, the water goes over the banks, velocity is reduced, sediments deposited, and then the water returns to the channel. There are basically 5 valid points in there. In fact, counting it to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7 for the example. So plenty for them to actually clock up the marks on that. And actually, you can see it's 12. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 lines there. So it's nearly ending up of 1 line per mark. So they really should be aiming to try and fill that space, obviously as intelligently as possible. Just another thing just to highlight there, which is kind of important, because it'd be very easy to go in and say, hey kids, look, learn all that off by heart. But actually you want them to appreciate the landscape and understand what that looks like in different media. So there's the photograph here, so they have an idea of what a levee actually looks like. And then this is the River Moy just outside Foxford. And it's nice to actually show them on the NOS map what those levees might actually look like if they were to come across them. And we could spend a while looking at what we could teach kids about what's happening with this river here and why there's no settlement immediately around the river and so on. But that's another day's work. Sketch map. This is kind of giggled when this came up this year, because I had Dungarvan, and Dungarvan was a sketch map we put in the book. But what they've done is they give you the frame and they give you the coastline, and then they ask you to fill in different features, and it's 1 + 1. So 1 for showing or the drawing of the feature, and then 1 for label. When I'm teaching this, I teach them how to draw the frame the correct size, and so I'm not easing up on the skills that I want to teach them in the classroom. I want them to get it right. But little things are kind of important, that will stand them in good stead. They need to have some kind of shaded in area. Now, typically, if I was doing this in class, like the color is there for the purpose because it's publication. But if I was doing this in class, I would just have this simply as hatchers or lines just to shade in the area. But they need to very clearly mark the feature and then add in the label. So I think what they were looking for here is 2 historical sites. So there's a castle in Dungarvan just here, and they could mark that. And then there's a road. This is the N25 rather than the N72, but you can see how it's marked. It's marked in green, and then you've got N25 written along it. And actually, just a little kind of point: the label on the key is the instruction, so a national primary road, but the label on the map is the actual name of the communication route. So things like that, and all the labels are horizontal except for the ones that follow communication routes like rivers and roads. And then of course they put in a title. So it's no harm to hold them to that particular standard if you can, to make sure that they've got the frame, the title, the label, the north points, and that they're shading in areas rather than drawing little pictures of trees, for example. So other than that, they should be able to get full marks in that, straightforwardly enough. Related to that was a question about why Dungarvan developed at this location, and I've put in the little section of the map that came with the exam, and the marking scheme provides some reasons, things like, you know, there's a port location, it's close to the river for trade, fertile farmland, and so on. But one of the things about all of the towns, or certainly the vast majority of the towns in Leinster, is they all have almost identical reasons why they grew. So in the textbook, I use the example of Carlow, but you could replace Carlow with pretty much any town in Leinster. They're bound to have a Norman castle. There's a castle in Dungarvan. They're bound to have a bridging point. There's a bridging point that connects, you know, the east to the west. If it's a town, it's a focus point of routeways. So all the major routeways come in on Dungarvan. It may have a railway, but you'd have to sort of double check. Not all towns would have that, but it may have a railway. And typically with the railway as well, quite often what you find is the railway station in the middle of the town, but when the railway was first built, the station would have been outside the town, and the town has grown up around it. And you see that in Carlow. So here's the railway station, but it wouldn't have originally been there. Originally, that was the edge of the town, because trains were steam trains and they were noisy and smelly, and so they were put on the outskirts of towns. And what's happened is the town tends to build up around them. So that gives you evidence for development over time. And then of course there's the implied evidence that most towns, in fact all towns, are service centres, so they offer service to the people living in the town and surrounding area. So it's almost like that even though that's for Carlow, it's almost like a template that would apply to any town that comes up. And once they have those, it really doesn't matter what town they ask them, so long as, you know, they check for things like the railway, just to make sure that they're there. And there's other reasons as well. Like I do like the farmland component there. So what do they need? Name the reason and provide one valid point was all that was asked here, and then one piece of evidence. So they'd have to give a grid reference for that. But otherwise, it's a straightforward question. This is nice. This particular learning outcome, when that was being designed, there was a very clear intention that that junior cycle students would have some appreciation of their experience of life compared to people in the developing world. And so that's really the origins of that, and the focus is on young people. So for this question, they're looking for one way that the life of young people is different. And this is kind of important because in the marking scheme it says if there's no element of comparison, the maximum marks you can get is 4 out of 8, so you don't get half marks. So you can't say things like well, in Ireland we have better schools and we can go to school for longer. That wouldn't be enough. You'd have to say, what's it like on the for developing countries? So in this case, we use Tanzania. So they have a state school, but you could look at, say, the experience of girls, how quite often they aren't able to stay in school for as long, and they have to drop out and do work at home and so on. So I just put that sample from 334 in the book. You wouldn't need all of that, but you could certainly pick out 3 points of comparison. between them. There was something else there. Yeah, it doesn't have to be education. It could be anything. But when they're writing this, they should say, well, for young people, here's what the experience is. And yeah, there's a connection there to, funny enough, to Leaving Cert, because sometimes you get like a regional question at Leaving Cert where they ask you to compare, say, primary activities in two Irish regions or two European regions, or secondary activities. And typically students are quite poor at comparing. What they tend to do with those is go, here's everything I know about primary in the GDA, and here's everything I know about primary in the Northwest region, rather than comparing them back and forth to each other. So just a little pointer on that. So this question is kind of interesting. Again, I'm kind of avoiding the little ones. These are all just 3 markers, but these are your key words. You know, what's bilateral aid, what's an NGO, what's emergency aid. So straightforward enough. I thought this question was interesting when it came up at part 4. It's potentially a bit confusing for students, because the question is, will aid cause the population to rise or fall, right? And they have to go, well, you know, well, I don't know. Aid, maybe it'll help the population rise, okay? But in actual fact, the marketing scheme will allow you to pick either, so long as you justify it. And so hence this kind of rubric that they've used for marking. And it again, student can come down on one side or the other, or even both. You'd be kind of aiming them towards providing a sort of an excellent answer where they provide enough detail. So I've just picked this one out from 294. It's improved technology reduces the death rate. Vaccines mean that fewer children die before the age of 5. And that means they survive to have children on their own. And so the population increases. But of course, over the longer period of time, you know, as children survive, they have fewer children. So you could see how it could be either population increase or decrease. And I think for 6 marks, you know, there would be plenty in that to answer that question. The other thing is these marks are indivisible, so it's either 2, 4, or 6. And I think that's kind of important, because I've taken out the space that they provided. I think there were 8 lines in there, maybe 6. But you want students to kind of intelligently write about you know, what's occurred to them, almost to assume as if they're trying to actually teach it themselves, and not assume that the examiner can see inside their heads and know exactly what they're thinking. This, I had an interesting chat with a colleague about this particular question. So you had to name a town that you studied, and then explain one problem that's found in that town or city that you studied. And we had this chat about whether inner city decline was still a thing, and it is. It's not as prevalent as it was, but it's still there. But students don't have to jump to inner city decline. They could go for the sort of more low-hanging fruit of urban sprawl or traffic congestion, and all they have to do is name the problem, so 2 marks, and then give 3 valid points, and they've got 8. And it really is just a case of describing that. And if they're coming to school on a bus in the morning, or if they're coming in the car, they'll know all about traffic congestion, pretty much regardless of where they are. So you know, it should be possible for them to combine what they're learning in the classroom with just their own experience of that and what they can see around them. So but either one of those answers would be fine. And this one at urban sprawl is actually kind of split up for them, so it's straightforward and enough. The climate change question. So they're looking for two impacts. So name the impact and then 3 valid points. This is a bit frustrating because they don't give you the headline marks, and you don't know how many marks are assigned on the paper. Now, there's very good reasons for that, although it's incredibly frustrating. But you would like there to be some consistency in terms of how many marks are allocated to the valid points. But it's 14 marks overall, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 12 lines in there. So it's nearly, you know, a mark per line. So 2 points, they've numbered them for them, and they could pick any 2 and just describe them. Of course, our kids are all experts on climate change at this stage. So fairly straightforward answers, I think, for that question. Migration, hot topic. I'd be very surprised if there wasn't something on that on the exam this year, notwithstanding the way the pattern has developed. So when people move to a new place, it can have an impact on the place they leave and the place they move to. So that's donor and what source or destination, or donor recipient region. So they can pick either, but they need to obviously name the impact and then give 3 valid points, and it can be either. So they need to make sure that they're writing very clearly about the donor region, or the destination region, or the recipient region, or the receiver region, whichever term they want to use for that. And so I just put the link or sample from economic impacts there. There's also social and environmental, and I'll actually come back to that when we're having a look at CBAs. But all they need is 3 points, and there's 4 there. So they can, it should be easy enough to, again, have those. And again, anybody who's kind of listening to what's going on in Ireland at the moment would have an idea of the impacts of migration in Ireland, and that could either be some of the negative impacts that we see in the news, or it could be the positive things like the influence of the cultural benefits of Ukrainian refugees in Ireland, while they're here. This question was interesting. The HTI provided some feedback to the SEC on this when it came up originally, because you might recall in the sample paper, I think it was, they asked students to draw a diagram of a volcano, and they had to label, I think, actually I can't even recall if they actually had the key words, but it was problematic because it's almost like it was an art exam rather than a geography question. And while that's okay, there's you still have to be able to draw a diagram and identify it correctly. It seemed better to actually ask a solid question about volcanoes. So you have to explain how volcanoes are formed, right? So there's I think it's 6 valid points there, and then a diagram. So for a total of 14. One of the things that's interesting is they use the term layers of ash and rock, rather than say layers of lava or cinders and ash. And so I've highlighted cinders and ash because that's what we put into the text originally, and pretty much what every textbook actually uses. But maybe they weren't going to do that. They wanted to keep this a little bit different, just have rock in there. But I've split that up into 5 points. And you might wonder, well, what's the 6 point? 6 points is actually say what a volcano is. So a volcano is a conical mountain that forms from lava erupting from a volcano. And then you've got this stage by stage build up. But they kind of like that question because it's straightforward enough, and I think it's relatively easy to answer, and they should be able to do quite well on it. This one here, explain how vegetation influences soil. Now, this is a tricky one because depending on your cohort, this little section can be quite difficult. The hardest bit about it is actually the fact that it's called the nutrient cycle. But I think this is our job as teachers, is when we're teaching this, if we simplify it, this is easy enough to understand, and it's straightforward enough. You have soil, plants grow in the soil, the plants produce plant litter that goes back into the soil, and so you have this cycle of nutrients moving through the soil, and all they need then is a way to describe that accurately, and that's the bit that's tricky. So we put this in stages here. So nutrients enter the soil from parent material, the plants absorb the nutrients, the nutrients are decay into humus, and then the cycle repeats itself as plants take up those nutrients. And then if there's too much rainfall, leaching occurs, and that can prevent plants from absorbing nutrients. So the scheme actually mentions plant litter, leaching. I haven't put soil erosion in here, but you could include that obviously in the answer. The alternative to explaining this is to actually pick a soil type and say, like say brown soil, and say how the deciduous leaf matter that it produces a rich humus that enriches the soil, that keeps it fertile, that produces um, a brown soil. But they only need 3 valid points here. So I think it's very important as a concept, because if we don't conserve soil, you know, I think it was Franklin Roosevelt who said that the nation that loses soil loses its wealth. So tricky enough, but I think worth doing. This question is quite nice, and what they ask you to do is to look at the slopes and then ask you where you're likely to get a particular type of mass movement. So you can see the link here to prevention of soil erosion into mass movement, and that's the kind of cross-topic, or they call it non-linear, but anyway, cross-topic thinking that you really want your students to connect with. And the more they can do that, it's difficult at junior cycle, but the more they do that, the more they'll get to grips with how to study and revise for the exam in June. So what you have to do is state 2 reasons why one of these locations is more likely to experience mass movement. So obviously location B with the steeper slopes. So 2 reasons, name them, and then should be straightforward enough. Okay, so steeper slope, less vegetation, more likely to produce mass movement. This one kind of giggled a little bit when I saw this as well. It's a photograph of a bog flow, which actually just happens to be the Shash Mountain bog burst in 2020. That photograph is just this taken from a different angle. But name 2 types of primary activity that you can be seen in the photograph. So you've got farming, and peat as well will be in there. You might spot something else relevant to that. Name 1 effect of bog burst on the landscape. So name it, and then 2 valid points that would describe it. And it's straightforward enough. So things like peat going over farmland, livelihoods of farmers being impacted, residents being afraid they might lose their housing, that kind of thing. Fish kills is another one, like with the Derry brine mud flow, and then blocked roads obviously in there. So that was a nice little question. So this one's important. I was going to leave it till CBAs, but actually no harm to mention it here. So 1 economic and 1 environmental impact of exploiting rocks. I think everybody's pretty okay with this. It's name it and then give a valid point, and then 2 lots of that, right? So 8 marks in total. One of the key things running all the way through the junior cycle geography specification is the social impacts or consequences, economic impacts or consequences, environmental impacts or consequences of human activities. So any opportunity you have to quiz students on those, so that they think that when they approach any situation where we're interacting with the landscape, that they're thinking about that. It could be anything, like what are the environmental consequences of multinational companies, right, in Ireland? What are the environmental impacts of, say, farming? What are the environmental impacts of not harvesting peat anymore, right? Stuff like that. So the more you kind of get kids thinking along those lines, they actually get to the point where they can correctly identify the consequences without actually having to go and read stuff and go, oh yeah, that's what that says, and kind of realizing, because a lot of it is quite often common sense. Now, for some case studies like this one of Tara Mines that we have, there's specific details like the number of workers who have full-time jobs there. Tara Mines has been in the news lately because it shut down temporarily, and they're looking to get it back up and running again. And the company's intention is that it will continue to operate. But specific details like that, are good to have just in case. Carbonation karst comes up again. I think it would be unusual at junior cycle if there was never a question on limestones in some way, shape, or form in the exam, just like in the Leaving Cert, because limestone is so prevalent in Ireland. But all you have to do is explain carbonation and 4 valid points. And sure, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now there's more detail there than they need, but you can see that the key terms are all being hit here, and the more of those they use, the better. And it's 8 marks, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, nearly a mark per line. And it's not a bad way. I actually start off with my first years by telling them that when they're writing answers to things, that every sentence they write has just one idea. So they don't use the word and. It's like one idea, then give me the next idea, then give me the next idea. And then later on we learn to write slightly more complicated sentences once they're thinking in terms of individual concepts. So look, that's just the exam. It's not all of it, but just some of the key kind of questions that came up last year. There's those keyword type questions again, chemical and mechanical weathering. Just to talk a little bit about CBAs, okay? Because it's kind of funny. You might have heard me before say this. I had a student one year who literally got off the airplane that morning and landed into class at 9 o'clock. And I was introducing the program for the year, and I was saying to them, you know, when we get to term 2, we'll talk about CBAs. And this girl just looked at me and she was like frozen in fear. I go, what's made you feel this way? And she goes, everybody's talking about CBAs. I said, forget about it. It's going to be okay. So they hadn't built up to be a big sort of thing in their head. It's really just a project like you might have always done. And there's a lot of what I think is highly superfluous information, and indeed some of it quite misleading information in the assessment guidelines, that they could strip it right down and make it much more simple. And I think that's what I've done here. So this is literally off the assessment guidelines. In fact, it's table 1. So students for CBA 1 do geography in the news. We're doing this at the moment. They do a structured inquiry on a recent geographical event. Recent is any time in their lifetime, so 14, 15 years, give or take, okay? And that's it. I'm not even reading the rest of the thing, because I don't need to worry about that. I'm just going to get them to pick a news story that's recent and research it, okay? And then for geography, CBA 2, they investigate an aspect of their local area. The origins of that CBA is in the tradition that rose in the 1990s of local studies, which was like a major kind of movement of a sort of a reinvigoration of inquiry into local areas. And what we wanted students to do was to engage with some aspect of their own local geography and investigate it. And it was called a geographical investigation. Now, originally when they published the assessment guidelines, they were making this a requirement for students, and that was a problem because there was no funding for either teachers to go out, never mind to take class groups out and buy equipment and so on. So it can be a little bit misleading to see geographical investigation and think that it's something like a mini version of the Leaving Cert. And I'd almost suggest that if you can, avoid doing a sort of a dry run of the Leaving Cert GI. But you know, you have to kind of decide what works for your own cohort. In terms of the features of quality, I've only put up the exceptional one up there. So I do introduce my students to this idea of what features of quality are. But I'm not going to tell them about yet to meet and in line with and above, because I don't want them to pick one of those and go, I'm gonna just do that amount of work that will get me that. I say, look, this is what I want you to do this, right? So I want you to engage with all the questions really, really well. I want you to tell me why your news event is important. Tell me about sustainability, and we have to have a chat about that. Tell me about processes, patterns, systems, and make sure it's well presented, neatly organized, and all of this kind of stuff, right? And so that's what I aim them towards. And it doesn't work, but I aim there because invariably students kind of realize that they're not getting an actual, it doesn't feel like they're getting a grade or they're getting anything for it. So I don't spend too long on this, and I spend more time trying to make sure that they're engaging earnestly with the thing and putting in a decent effort. So to kind of make this kind of simple, what we put in the book was all these little CBA warm-ups, right? Um, I don't have any L2 students, but if you had an L2 student, this text might still be a little bit difficult for some of them, but you know, you pick and choose what what you wanted to do with this, like it's because it's a resource, right? This is basically a CBA. That is a geography in the news CBA. If you remember Nevada Del Ruiz, that case study of the Lahar from 1985, this is sort of an updated version of that kind of thing from 2018. It obviously wasn't as disastrous in terms of the number of people killed, but you know, it was significant in its own right. But what I've got is I have a photograph, I have a map, I've located it so you can see where it is, and I have the story, right? So there's like a bunch of questions at the end here, which are kind of like comprehension questions, but they're the 5WH geographical questions. And what the students do is I actually set this to them in first year. I said, go and answer all those questions, right? And we do it in stages. Um, and so they had to give me a little summary of what happened. They have to tell me when the event happened. So it absolutely has to have a date. And they have to tell me where it happened and give me a little sketch map, because that's how you show where. And they have to tell me who was affected by it and who helped or hindered. So they're working their way through the 5WH questions. So if I have, and every now and again, I'll get a particularly weak student and I'll go, look, you just answer those questions and make me a nice poster, and we'll leave it at that, okay? And I you know, but for stronger students, I'd say, well, look, that's one news source. Go find 2 other news sources or 3 other news sources, and get as many different answers as you can to the who, what, why, when, where, how, and then we'll organize that data. So I actually have a little booklet where they can take notes, and so they'll take notes on the who, notes on the where, what, why, when. So once they've done that, the second thing that I get them to do is to organize the answers to these questions, right? So the summary is the summary. So that's the answer to question 2, right? And it includes the when. And I get them to throw in why it was a significant event, because they have to write about its significance. And then I'll say, well, tell me about the patterns. So they'll actually have like a poster, or they'll have a slide on their PowerPoint that will say patterns. And what do they write into patterns? They write the answers to the what and the where questions. So down here, and they might even include, like, if there was a history of that volcano erupting, so there would be a trend in there as well. I've seen versions of this where, you know, it's suggested that you have a section on patterns, a section on processes, a section on social impacts, economic impacts, and then a section on interconnections, and then another section on interactions. And that's duplication. Patterns are interconnections, process and systems are interactions, and then social impacts, economic impacts, they're implications. So these words in parentheses, these are the geoliteracy words. They don't need to have separate panels, they're just duplicating. So the ones in bold are the headings that they should use, because awareness of patterns, processes, systems in the areas, right? So that's what it is. And then sustainability at the end. And so what this does is that kind of gives them a rubric or a frame that they can use to organize their answers. So I give them again, in their booklet, they have a little box where they write in the social impacts, and then a little bit where they write in the economic impacts, and so on. And literally, it's gather as much notes as you can, organize them, type them up nicely, make me a nice poster. And if they do that, they're kind of already aiming for exceptional. And they won't all get there, but they're all kind of aiming for exceptional at that stage. And it's, you know, it's up to them then. They decide whether or not they want to keep going to that level. For CBA 2, my geography, it doesn't have to be a field trip, and it doesn't have to be a mini geographical investigation. It could be, but you know, I think there's a lot that you could do here, and I'm going to show you an example of one that we did. This column here, these are the headings. So this, if they were doing a poster, they'd have, you know, a little panel on each of these. If it was a PowerPoint, they might have slides. If it was a video, they'll have little sections on this. So they have to think up the questions that they would want to find out. And we actually would do this in class. And I'll show you an example of one that we do. They'd have to collect data. Now, the data collection can be anything. It could literally be something as programmed as, say, a questionnaire, but it could also be, if you were to do a mini GI, it could be angles of the beach or the width of a river or something like that. But you can also have visual data. You can also have information data, if you like, or description. So, for example, we go to Glendalough, and in the field there are notice boards for tourists that explain the landscape, and they can collect information from that they can use for their CBA too. And then what they do is, once they've collected all their data, they have to analyze it and organize it. And they might have diagrams or charts, depending on what they're doing. And then they have to put their findings together. So that's where the patterns, processes, and systems are going to come in. And then they'll produce a bunch of conclusions, and that will include sustainability as well as the effects of whatever it is they're investigating. And then the evaluation bit's important. So how well did they gather data that informs their work? What worked well? What would they do differently in future? So a little bit like almost the evaluation section at the end of the Leaving Cert GI. And then the reflection bit's really important. This is important because it's going to feed into the assessment task. And so you want them thinking in terms of what did they learn about their local geography from the data collection that they did, and from presenting their findings and drawing conclusions. There is a sample one of these. Now again, it's not based on anything from the SEC. There's a sample one of these in the teacher's guide. Like if you ask the reps about that, they'll drop you out one. I don't have one that I'd show you, but that would be a useful thing to get students kind of thinking about. So we used to always do a field trip to Glendalough in second year, and what we did is we moved it into third year, and we tried it this year as a sort of a mock CBA too, just to see how it would work, and it tended to work quite well. So we divided the landscape up into the upper valley, the land between the two lakes, the monastic settlement. We looked at the hanging valley that's there at Pool Nass, and there's similar landscapes in different parts of the country. And what the students did was they had to answer questions about what they were looking at in the landscape. So the approach that we took as a teacher is an interrogative approach. So we're kind of directing them to look and say, what's that over there? That's a truncated spur. Well, how do you know that's a truncated spur? Oh, we did glaciation last year. Great. What about that tells you it's a truncated spur? What was it beforehand, and why do you think it's truncated? And so, what direction was the ice moving? So they have to answer a whole bunch of questions. And someday I'll do a thing on that. It might be useful. It wouldn't have enough time to go through the whole thing. But just to show you, sorry, we have these warm-up CBAs as well. There's a whole bunch of ideas. There's one for farming. Watch out for safety and well-being there. There's a manufacturing company that would tie in nicely to actually that topic when you were teaching it. And then there's one on, say, a local town. And I think there's a couple on soil, and there's one on land use. So there's a bunch of those in the book. But anyway, this was the Glendalough one that we did. So you can see the way there's different panels. Now I don't know how legible that is to you, but you've got the mining in there, you've got tourism, positive impacts, negative impacts of tourism. Unfortunately, there's no map, but nice photographs of what's going on in the landscape. This was another one. So this one was handwritten, and sorry if I go back, but that was handwritten, which is perfectly okay, and he used color panels, which is kind of nice. This was obviously typed, so it looks a little bit neater. Probably could have been a little bit more, well arranged. No map, but some nice photographs, and influence of rivers, influence of ice, the geology, sustainability is in there, mining, so you've got the human interaction. So quite an interesting one. This was kind of a little bit the lower end of the scale. This was probably in line with expectations, I felt. Really the main issue, and I think it's the real difference between the different descriptors is just how much detail they put in. Some nice sketches though, sadly no photographs, but some lovely sketches. And they've brought in what they learned about waterfalls and what they've learned about quarries from year 2 into that. But that was okay. And this was kind of nice. What was interesting about this is that there's not a huge amount of information, but I had a student like this a number of years ago who produced what we used to call the Glendalough report, and it was quite a weak report, but visually it was fantastic. They went off to become a photographer, and you could see how they were playing to their strengths when they were doing that particular project. So, you know, academically it wasn't fantastic in terms of detail. I could see where they were going, and they're a photographer. So maybe this student's kind of gone that way. They had these photographs. He just photocopied the board or photographed the board rather than extracting the information out. This was nice, and I mentioned these information boards they have in the valley, which is interesting. So Conor, back to you. That's all I have. I hope that was useful to you. If you had any questions, you could throw into Q&A.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks very much for that, Peter. Remember, we were talking about this. Obviously, assessment's a big thing, always, and always generates some interest. And we were wondering about whether to do the exam or whether we do the CBA. So we decided to cover both key elements of assessment and to get through that in the time that you have, in such detail, is fantastic. So thanks so much for that. I think you'll have noticed as well during Peter's presentation that he gave a nod, or he included some screenshots of parts of the real world geography teaching package, particularly the textbook. So you would have seen the keyword connection sections, you would have seen the CBA warm-ups, obviously, when he was going through all of that, and then obviously doing kind of a side-by-side comparison between the exam preparation sections that we have, or the exam expert sections that we have in the book alongside the paper. So as I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to check out a little bit more about what we have in the teaching package for real world geography, you can go on to folens.ie and take a closer look at everything that we've got. But also our local Folens rep is available if you need to get in contact with them. We've got highly experienced bunch of people there on the road, and you know, within a phone call away from you, who you can contact and are available for appointments if you need to at your convenience, and particularly with the upcoming government funded scheme for junior cycle, we've got solutions that we can offer and help you with, if that's something that you'd like to talk through with them. So the link's in there in chat. Karan, thanks for adding that in. And if you want to contact your rep, you can do that. So we will, now that we've got the sort of the pitch out of the way, we'll get on to the Q&A. So maybe Peter, if you just jump on to the next slide, just to remind me of where we are at. I'm going to just take a quick look to see what we've got, and we've had some other questions that I remember that we've been asked that I can maybe throw in your direction. Okay, so this one asks, how do you get a distinction in the junior cycle geography paper? That's probably a question you could ask of any junior cycle subject there, because it's such a tight window, isn't it? Like there's no room for error really, or no margin for error in the paper if you want to get that kind of score, that kind of grading.
36 marks. It's 10%. Yeah, look, it's a very tough one. Obviously, controversial one, because there were so few distinctions, and people were kind of saying, well, compared to what you have to do at the Leaving Cert to get a H1, it seemed much harder to get a distinction at junior cycle, and there didn't seem to be any correlation between the two. Do you know what? There isn't an easy answer here. Obviously, do you know what? It's not even as simple as your students. Excuse me. Sorry, guys. Got a chill last week. Still trying to shake it. It's not as simple as if your students know the material better, they're more in line for distinction. That's undoubtedly true, but time management is everything. It sounds terrible. They have to do the 10 questions. They can't leave any bit undone, because every little mark they throw away is going to eat away at that distinction. So there's nothing for it, but they have to literally work through the paper like the clappers, right? And I was thinking about this with my classes and kind of thinking, well, maybe if they did all the short questions first and then went back into the paragraph questions, but then sometimes there's a link between the short question and the next paragraph question that follows. So what I found when I was testing the sample paper with my students was the weak students weren't really writing very much. The very strong students, the ones that I would have thought would have been well in line for distinctions, were writing too much and they weren't getting the paper complete. And then students that might have been traditionally, say, B students, they were actually doing better because they were getting more questions started. And I certainly think one of the most important things is that if a student doesn't know the answer immediately, they don't stop to dwell on it. They move on very, very quickly. So it's time management is really important. Other things like not spending too long on diagrams, like you don't get marks for coloring diagrams in. I mean, they should be clear and labeled always, but they really just have to work quickly. And so practicing past papers, you know, depending on who you buy them from, I know the range is quite limited at the moment because we've only had really 2 years of this, but practicing those questions and timing them so that they're not going over you know, the amount of time. It's somebody whose maths is better than mine, they've 120 minutes to get 360 marks, so it's about is it a minute per mark kind of a thing. So even that doesn't help because you don't know how many marks there are for each question. So it really is a case of not dwelling on a question if it doesn't come to you immediately and flying through the paper and then coming back and filling any gaps, but definitely don't leave anything unanswered. Know the keywords. Like you could, I mean, I was trying to explain this to my students. You could have a student who explains, say, for example, how waterfalls form, and they hit the nail on the head. They describe it almost perfectly. But if they're not using the key language or the target language, you know, the key words, then they're not going to get the marks. So you have to hit the key terms really in there. Now they're still going to do well, but it's the student that's showing that overall knowledge of the syllabus that I think will do best. I don't have a formula other than getting my kids to make sure that they tick those boxes. But yeah, it's a tough one. Sorry, I wish I had a better answer than that.
Just conscious of time, I might just switch then to a question on CBAs. For both of the CBAs, how can you actually get them done in 3 weeks?
Yeah, right. Use that frame that I showed you. Use that frame. With my second years, they spent 1 week gathering information. This week they're organizing that information, and next week they're going to type it up. They've only got 2 hours each week. They will have to do maybe a little bit outside of class, but so far I've managed to keep them on progress. But it's difficult, and I think so long as they work efficiently, that's really the challenge. As long as they're focused and engaged, and they aren't always. But what I've done is I set mine a task to do in class, and they don't finish it in class, then they have to take it home. So they have an incentive to finish it in class. So 1 week to gather the information, 1 week to organize it, 1 week to type it up. And so far that's working.
Okay. That's great. Thanks so much, Peter, for that great presentation and for your answers also. So I think I'll wrap it up. We're bang on 8 o'clock actually. So thanks for everyone for sticking for us a little bit longer than anticipated. The recording and the PowerPoint deck will be made available very shortly on folens.ie. So if anyone would like to go there and to take a look again at the recorded webinar and also download the PowerPoint, you can do it. Peter, you're getting lots of thanks already coming through from everybody. So it seems that you've done a good job there.
And I'm on Facebook if people want to get in touch with me there as well. They can do that.
Great. Well, look, I'll wrap it up. Peter, again, thanks so much for that.
Thanks everybody.
And I'd like to also, just to everyone out there who's stuck with us for this long, just to thank them for joining us this evening, because I know particularly if you're involved in any way with Leaving Cert, this is an incredibly busy time for you. So thanks for giving us a little bit more than that 45 minutes we thought it would take, and hopefully you feel that it was time well spent. So from myself and from Peter, thanks very much for joining us, and we'll hope to see you at the next webinar. All the best.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Conor.